The moment I saw Amber step into our vow renewal ceremony on Mark's arm, wearing that sleek blue dress that matched his tie perfectly, I knew my suspicions had been right all along. For months, he'd denied there was anything between them, called me paranoid, said I was imagining things. But I wasn't imagining the way his hand lingered at the small of her back, or how she leaned into him as they walked toward the lakeside altar where we were supposed to recommit to our 15 years of marriage. What Mark didn't realize was that, while he'd been busy with his executive assistant, I'd been busy too, preparing a surprise of my own. In my purse were documents showing I was the true owner of Evergreen Construction, the company he believed was his crowning achievement, the company he had no idea I'd been quietly funding since day one. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I never meant to become the silent investor in my husband's business. When I met Mark Wilson at a charity fundraiser for Portland's homeless youth 16 years ago, I was already successful in my own right, though few people knew the extent of it. My grandfather had left me a substantial inheritance when I was 28, but I'd grown tired of men pursuing me for my money rather than who I was as a person. So when I introduced myself to the charming contractor with the infectious laugh and ambitious dreams, I simply said I worked in financial consulting. It wasn't a lie. I did manage my own portfolio, but it wasn't the whole truth either. Mark was different from the men I usually met. He was self-made, hardworking, with calloused hands and grand visions of revitalizing Portland's aging industrial districts with sustainable development projects. He talked about his dreams with such passion that I couldn't help but be drawn in. When he mentioned the challenges of securing funding for his first major development project, it seemed natural to offer some connections who might be interested in investing. Those connections were actually my investment companies, operating through various LLCs and management firms. I had spent years developing a network of businesses that allowed me to invest without my name being directly attached. It wasn't about deception. It was about being taken seriously in a world that often dismissed wealthy women as dilettantes playing with inherited money. Our relationship moved quickly. Within a year, we were married in a simple ceremony at the Japanese garden, surrounded by close friends and Mark's family. My side of the aisle was notably emptier. My parents had passed away years before, and I'd always been something of a loner, focused on learning the intricacies of business and investment rather than building a wide social circle. In those early years, our partnership felt equal and honest, despite my financial omission. Mark built Evergreen Construction from a small contracting business into a respected development firm, while I offered advice and connections that helped secure the necessary funding and contracts. I told myself I would explain everything someday, when the time was right, when his pride wouldn't be wounded by the knowledge that his wife had been bankrolling his success from the shadows. But that day never seemed to come. As Evergreen grew, so did Mark's ego. The humble, hardworking contractor I'd fallen in love with gradually transformed into someone who enjoyed being the big man at industry events, who referred to me as the wife when introducing me to business associates, who began spending more time at the office and less time in our craftsman home in Portland's historic Irvington neighborhood. I first noticed Amber Collins 3 years ago when Mark hired her as his executive assistant. Fresh out of business school, with honey blonde hair and an eagerness to please, she embodied a type I recognized immediately: ambitious, calculating, and all too aware of how to use her youth and attractiveness to advance professionally. I said nothing when Mark mentioned giving her a substantial raise after just 6 months, or when their meetings regularly ran late, or when business trips that once lasted 2 days now stretched to 4 or 5. Perhaps I should have confronted him then, but something held me back. Pride, maybe, or the nagging fear that the man I loved might choose her youth over our history. Instead, I threw myself into my own projects, taking a more active role in the charitable foundation I'd established in my parents' memory, and spending more time with my closest friend Olivia, who had been warning me about Mark's behavior for months. "You need to prepare yourself, Becca," Olivia had said over lunch at our favorite waterfront restaurant last spring. "Men like Mark don't just wake up one day and start being dishonest. It's a pattern, and it usually escalates." But even Olivia didn't know the full extent of my financial involvement in Evergreen. No one did, except for Daniel Goldstein, my attorney, and Eleanor Walsh, my business mentor who had helped me structure my investments after my grandfather's death. It was Eleanor who first suggested I review the company's recent financial activities after I mentioned some concerns over lunch 3 months ago. "Something doesn't feel right," I had told her, picking at my salad. "Mark's been secretive about the new River District project, and when I asked to see the prospectus, he laughed it off, said it was boring business stuff I wouldn't understand." Eleanor's eyes had narrowed at that. At 70, she'd built and sold 2 successful tech companies and had no patience for men who underestimated women. "Review everything," she advised. "Now, today. Use your access as the primary investor to check every transaction, every contract, every email if you have to. When men get defensive about money, they're usually hiding something." She was right, of course. That evening, I logged into the secure server where all of Evergreen's financial records were stored, a server Mark had no idea I had complete access to. What I found sent me into a tailspin of disbelief and rage that kept me awake until dawn. Mark had been systematically diverting funds from our main development projects into a separate LLC named A&M Ventures. It didn't take much research to discover that A stood for Amber and M for Mark. They had been quietly purchasing properties adjacent to our planned developments, using inside information to snap them up before news of our projects could increase their value. But that wasn't all. There were hotel receipts, dinner reservations, a weekend spa retreat in Napa, all business expenses charged to Evergreen, all shared with Amber. The final blow was an email exchange where they discussed their future plans. "Once the River District project closes, we'll have enough capital to break away and start our own firm. Rebecca never reads the financial reports anyway. She'll never know how we structured the exit." I sat in my home office, watching the sun rise over the Portland skyline, my hands shaking with a combination of fury and an odd sense of clarity. For 15 years, I had diminished myself to protect Mark's pride. I had hidden my financial acumen, my business instincts, my very intelligence behind a carefully constructed persona of the supportive wife. For what? So he could dismiss me as financial deadweight while planning his escape with a woman 15 years my junior? That morning, I called Daniel Goldstein. "I need you to prepare some documents," I told him, my voice steady despite my lack of sleep. "And I need them to clearly establish my ownership position in Evergreen construction." Daniel, ever the professional, asked no personal questions. "What exactly are you looking to establish, Rebecca?" "The truth," I said simply. "That I am the majority owner and primary investor in Evergreen, that all major assets are secured by my personal investment vehicles, and that any attempt to divert company resources to outside entities constitutes fraud." "This is about Mark," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes." "When do you need these documents?" I thought about the invitation sitting on our kitchen counter, an elaborate card requesting our presence at Silver Lake Resort to renew our vows on our 15th anniversary, an event Mark had surprisingly insisted upon organizing himself. Now I understood why. It was to be his triumphant final act in our marriage, a public recommitment that would make his eventual departure seem all the more shocking and unexpected. 3 weeks from Saturday, I told Daniel. And I need them to be undeniable, irrefutable, and devastating in their clarity. Consider it done. Over the next 3 weeks, I maintained an outward calm that sometimes surprised even me. I selected an elegant cream dress for the renewal ceremony, had my dark hair styled in loose waves, confirmed arrangements with the 20 guests Mark had invited, mostly business associates and a few friends. When he mentioned that Amber would be attending to help coordinate the event details, I simply nodded and said that seemed practical. Meanwhile, Daniel and Eleanor helped me prepare for what would come after. We documented every questionable transaction, every misused company, fund, every property purchased by A&M Ventures using information only available to Evergreen insiders. We prepared legal notices freezing company assets pending a full audit. We even drafted press releases explaining the organizational restructuring that would soon take place at one of Portland's most prominent development firms. The morning of our vow renewal dawned clear and cool, a perfect early autumn day at Silver Lake Resort, about an hour outside Portland. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Mark had left early to check on the arrangements, leaving me to drive out separately. I took my time getting ready, carefully applying my makeup, slipping into my dress, and placing the folder of documents into my purse. As I looked at my reflection, in the mirror, I hardly recognized the woman staring back at me. Not because she looked different, but because for the first time in years, she looked fully present, fully awake, fully herself. When I arrived at the resort, the ceremony space had been beautifully arranged on a deck overlooking the lake. White chairs were set up in 2 small clusters. Flowers and ribbons decorated an arch where we would stand, and a string quartet played, softly in the corner. It was beautiful, intimate, and clearly expensive, all charged to Evergreen, I had no doubt. I mingled with the arriving guests, accepting congratulations and compliments with a gracious smile that revealed nothing of my inner thoughts. Then Mark arrived with Amber at his side, both of them looking slightly flushed and adjusting their clothing in a way that suggested they'd been doing more than reviewing ceremony details. The matching blue of his tie and her dress, a color I had always told Mark brought out his eyes, was the final confirmation I needed. As they moved toward the ceremony area, greeting guests and playing the perfect host and assistant, I felt a strange calm settle over me. This wasn't just about a husband's infidelity or a wife's revenge. This was about honesty, about standing in my full power after years of making myself smaller, about reclaiming not just my financial investment, but my very sense of self. The ceremony was set to begin at 4 p.m., timed so that our renewal of vows would happen just as the sun began its descent toward the mountains, bathing the lake in golden light. The officiant, a justice of the peace Mark knew through business connections, took his position under the arch. The guests settled into their seats. Mark moved to stand beside the officiant, gesturing for me to join him. This was the moment, the fork in the road where I could proceed as planned and publicly expose his betrayal, or take the easier path of confronting him privately later. As I felt all eyes on me, I thought of all the women who had been dismissed, underestimated, or betrayed by partners who viewed them as accessories rather than equals. I thought of my own mother, who had surrendered her promising career to support my father's ambitions, only to find herself financially vulnerable after his early death. I thought of Eleanor, who had fought for decades to be taken seriously in male-dominated industries. And I thought of myself, of all the times I had bitten my tongue when Mark explained basic financial concepts I had mastered years before we met, of the pride I had swallowed when he introduced me as just my wife, to important business contacts, of the silent calculations I had made to protect his ego at the expense of my authenticity. No more. I walked slowly toward the arch, my cream dress catching the late afternoon light, my purse clutched perhaps a bit too tightly in my hand. When I reached Mark, he gave me his practiced public smile, the one that showed just the right amount of teeth, and crinkled his eyes in a way that people found charming. I had once found it charming too. "You look beautiful," he whispered, taking my hands in his. "Thank you," I replied, my voice steady. "Before we begin, there's something I need to share with everyone." A flicker of confusion crossed his face, quickly replaced by the confident smile of a man who believes he can handle any situation. "Of course, honey. Whatever you want." I turned to face our small audience, aware of Amber shifting uncomfortably in the front row, her eyes darting between Mark and me. "Thank you all for coming today," I began, my voice carrying clearly across the deck. "It means so much to have witnesses for important moments in life. Moments of commitment, moments of truth, moments of transformation." Mark squeezed my hand, in what I supposed was meant to be encouragement. I gently withdrew my fingers from his grasp. "Mark and I have been married for 15 years, I continued. During that time, Evergreen Construction has grown from a small contracting business into one of Portland's leading development firms. Many of you have done business with Evergreen, invested in Evergreen projects, or celebrated Evergreen successes. Nods and smiles from the audience. Mark beaming with pride beside me, clearly thinking this was a tribute to his business acumen. What most of you don't know, what Mark himself doesn't know, is that I am not just Mark's wife. I am the majority owner and primary investor in Evergreen Construction, and have been since its founding. The smiles froze. Mark's body stiffened beside me. From the corner of my eye, I saw Amber sit up straighter, her expression shifting from confusion to calculation. I reached into my purse and removed the folder Daniel had prepared, opening it to extract the key documents. "I have here the original investment structure," I said, my voice remaining calm and clear, "showing that the seed capital for Evergreen came from Wilson Financial Holdings, my personal investment vehicle established with my inheritance long before I met Mark." I handed the first document to Mark, whose hands took it automatically while his eyes remained fixed on my face in stunned disbelief. "I also have the current ownership certificates," I continued, demonstrating that I maintain 67% ownership of all Evergreen assets, properties, and subsidiaries through various investment entities. Another document placed in his increasingly unsteady hands. "And finally, I have here evidence of funds diverted from Evergreen to an entity called A&M Ventures over the past 18 months, along with a detailed accounting of company resources used for personal expenses unrelated to legitimate business activities." A hush fell over the small gathering as I placed the final document in Mark's hands. His face had drained of all color, the confident smile replaced by an expression of dawning horror as he glanced from the papers to my face and back again. Behind him, I could see Amber shifting uncomfortably in her seat, her eyes darting around, as if seeking an escape route. "Becca," Mark finally managed, his voice barely above a whisper. "What is this?" "The truth," I replied simply. "Something that's been in short supply between us lately." The justice of the peace, clearly sensing he had walked into a situation far beyond a romantic vow renewal, cleared his throat awkwardly. "Perhaps you would like a moment of privacy." "No need," I said, my voice steady. "Everything I'm saying is documented fact, and everyone here should hear it." I turned back to our guests, who sat in stunned silence. "I apologize for the unexpected turn of events. When Mark suggested renewing our vows, I had hoped it signified a recommitment to honesty and partnership. Instead, I discovered he and his assistant Amber have been systematically diverting funds from Evergreen to finance their own side venture and personal relationship." A collective gasp rippled through the audience. Several of Mark's business associates exchanged glances, no doubt mentally calculating how this might affect their own dealings with Evergreen. Olivia, seated in the back row, gave me a small nod of encouragement. Mark finally found his voice, though it came out strained and defensive. "This is ridiculous. These documents could mean anything. You're twisting things, making accusations, with no basis. The Napa Valley Spa weekend last month, I cut in. The one you told me was a contractors conference? $4,300 charged to Evergreen's corporate account. 2 massages, a private vineyard tour, and a California King suite with champagne service. I turned to look directly at Amber, whose face had flushed deep red. Tell me, was the deep tissue massage worth it? The receipt shows you opted for the 90-minute session. Amber stood abruptly, grabbing her purse. I don't have to listen to this. Mark, we should go. Yes, Mark, I said, my voice taking on an edge for the first time. Perhaps you should go with Amber. After all, your commitment to her seems far stronger than your commitment to our marriage or to the company that bears your name, but survives on my investment. Mark turned to face me fully now, anger replacing his initial shock. You've been lying to me for 15 years, he hissed. You let me believe Evergreen was mine, that I built it from nothing. What kind of wife does that? I met his gaze steadily. The kind who wanted her husband to feel proud of his achievements without being threatened by hers. The kind who believed that someday we'd be secure enough in our partnership that the financial details wouldn't matter. Clearly, I was wrong about that. He shook his head, desperation creeping into his expression. You can't do this. Those investors back there, they're here because of me, my relationships, my reputation. Your reputation, I repeated softly. Is that what you were thinking about when you created A&M Ventures to purchase the Riverside properties using insider information from Evergreen's development plans? Or when you told Amber in that email I found that I never reads the financial reports anyway? Mark paled further at the mention of the email, his eyes darting to the business associates seated behind us. You had no right to access my private communications. As the majority owner of Evergreen, I have every right to review communications sent through company servers and devices. A fact you might have known if you'd ever bothered to read the company policies you signed. One of the investors, Harold Benson, stood up from his chair. Mark, is this true? Have you been using Evergreen's market intelligence to make personal investments ahead of announced projects? Mark turned, plastering on a desperate version of his charming smile. Harold, this is a misunderstanding. Rebecca is upset, making accusations. I have copies of all the documentation for anyone who wants to review it, I interjected calmly, including the property transfers to A&M Ventures and the corresponding timeline of Evergreen's development announcements. The pattern is quite clear. Harold shook his head in disgust and began gathering his things. Others in the audience followed suit, murmuring among themselves as they prepared to leave. The beautiful lakeside ceremony was dissolving into a hasty exodus, with only Olivia remaining seated, her expression a mixture of sympathy and pride. Mark grabbed my arm, his fingers digging in with unexpected force. You're destroying everything, he growled, his public mask finally slipping completely. I looked pointedly at his hand until he released me. No, Mark. You destroyed it. I'm simply refusing to let you take me down with you. Amber approached us, her earlier embarrassment now replaced with calculation. Mark, we need to go. Now. She turned to me, attempting a conciliatory smile that didn't reach her eyes. Rebecca, I understand you're hurt, but surely we can discuss this privately. Come to some arrangement that protects everyone's interests. I almost had to admire her composure, her quick pivot from fleeing to negotiating. There will be discussions, I agreed, but they'll happen with lawyers present. In the meantime, both of you are suspended from Evergreen, effective immediately. Security at the office has already been notified, and your access credentials have been revoked. You can't lock me out of my own company, Mark exploded. My company, I corrected quietly. And yes, I can. Daniel Goldstein filed the paperwork this morning. The board, consisting primarily of my appointees, as the majority shareholder, has already approved emergency measures pending a full audit. As if on cue, my phone chimed with a text message. I glanced down to see Daniel's confirmation. Security in place at office. IT has secured all systems. Eleanor is meeting with key staff now. Mark must have read something in my expression, because he pulled out his own phone and began frantically typing, presumably trying to access company systems or contact allies within Evergreen. After a few moments, he looked up, his face a mask of fury and disbelief. My credentials aren't working. My email. He tried another approach, then another, growing more agitated with each failed attempt. As I said, I repeated calmly, your access has been revoked. The justice of the peace, who had been watching this exchange with increasing discomfort, finally spoke up. I assume we won't be proceeding with the vow renewal. Despite everything, I had to suppress a sudden inappropriate urge to laugh at the absurdity of his question. No, I confirmed. I think we've said everything that needs to be said. By now, almost all the guests had departed, leaving just the four of us, myself, Mark, Amber, and Olivia, who had quietly moved closer to stand supportively at my side. Mark seemed to deflate before my eyes, the full weight of his situation finally sinking in. He looked around at the abandoned ceremony site, the carefully arranged flowers now bearing witness to the death of our marriage rather than its renewal. What happens now? He asked, his voice hollow. Now you leave, I said simply. Both of you. My attorney will contact you tomorrow regarding next steps. In the meantime, I suggest you find legal representation. And if I fight this? A shadow of his former confidence flickered in his eyes. If I take this public, claim you deceived me, manipulated me? I met his gaze steadily. Then you'll face not only divorce proceedings, but criminal charges for fraud, embezzlement, and misuse of corporate resources. Every email, every diverted dollar, every property transaction through A&M Ventures, all of it documented, all of it actionable. I paused, letting the reality of his situation sink in. Is that really the fight you want to have, Mark? In public, with everything exposed? He stared at me for a long moment, searching for weakness or hesitation and finding none. Finally, without another word, he turned and walked away, Amber falling into step beside him. I watched them go, noting how she reached for his hand and how he pulled away, their united front already beginning to crumble under pressure. When they disappeared from view, Olivia squeezed my shoulder gently. You okay? I took a deep breath, realizing I'd been holding tension in every muscle. I will be. That was. She shook her head, seemingly at a loss for words. I knew you were strong, Becca, but that was something else entirely. 15 years of making myself smaller, I said quietly. 15 years of hiding my knowledge, my capabilities, my power. I didn't realize how heavy that burden was until I finally put it down. We stood in silence for a moment, looking out, over the lake where the setting sun had turned the water to liquid gold. The beauty of the scene stood in stark contrast to the emotional devastation that had just unfolded. Yet, somehow, it felt right. A reminder that beyond human drama, life continued, beautiful and indifferent. What actually happens now? Olivia finally asked. I considered the question, mentally reviewing the plans I'd developed with Daniel and Eleanor over the past weeks. Tomorrow, I meet with the Evergreen leadership team to explain the situation and outline our path forward. There will be shock, questions, probably some resentment from those loyal to Mark. And the divorce? That too, I acknowledged. Though, after today, I suspect Mark will opt for a quiet, quick settlement rather than a protracted battle he can't win. Olivia studied my face. You don't seem as upset as I would have expected. I did my grieving 3 weeks ago, I explained, when I found those emails, when I realized that the man I thought I knew The man I loved had never really existed. Or perhaps he did once, but ambition and ego transformed him into someone I no longer recognize. I sighed, gathering the documents that Mark had dropped on the ground during our confrontation. Today wasn't about grief. It was about reclaiming what's mine, my company, my dignity, my authentic self. As we walked back toward the parking area, I caught a glimpse of our reflection in the resort's large windows. Two women walking tall, moving forward with purpose. For the first time in years, I recognized myself completely in that reflection. No diminishment, no careful self-editing, no strategic modesty to protect a man's fragile ego. Just Rebecca Wilson, exactly as she was, meant to be. The next morning, I arrived at Evergreen's downtown Portland office at precisely 8:30 a.m., dressed in a charcoal gray suit that I'd purchased years ago, but rarely worn. Mark had once commented that it made me look too corporate, too serious. Today, serious was exactly the tone I needed to set. Eleanor was waiting for me in the lobby, impeccable as always in her signature tailored pants and silk blouse, her silver hair cut in a sharp bob that framed her strong features. At 72, she commanded any room she entered through sheer force of personality and decades of business acumen. The leadership team is assembled in the main conference room, she informed me, falling into step beside me as we headed toward the elevators. 14 people total, including department heads and project managers. Daniel is already up there, addressing some initial legal questions. And their mood? Eleanor's mouth quirked in a slight smile. Shocked, confused, a bit defensive. Jackson and Terry, Mark's most loyal lieutenants, are particularly prickly. The others seem to be in wait-and-see mode. I nodded, having expected exactly this. And security? In place. 2 officers by the main entrance, IT monitoring all system access attempts. Mark tried to log in remotely 3 times last night, then gave up. The elevator doors opened onto the executive floor, where glass-walled offices lined a central workspace. Heads turned as I walked past, expressions ranging from curiosity to concern to outright hostility. I had visited the office before, of course, but always as Mark's wife, there for company parties or to meet him for lunch. Today, I moved through the space with a different energy, my heels clicking purposefully on the hardwood floors. Outside, the conference room. I paused for a moment, gathering my thoughts. Through the glass walls, I could see the leadership team seated around the large table. Daniel at one end reviewing documents with several executives. The conversation stopped abruptly as I entered, all eyes turning to assess the woman who had apparently been their boss all along without their knowledge. "Good morning," I said, moving to the head of the table where Mark would normally sit. "Thank you all for coming in early. I recognize that yesterday's events have created significant confusion and concern, and I'm here to provide clarity and direction." Jackson Chen, the head of development and one of Mark's closest allies, leaned forward with barely concealed hostility. "With all due respect, Mrs. Wilson, we're not clear on what authority you have to call this meeting. Mark is the CEO and founder of Evergreen." "Actually," Daniel interjected smoothly, sliding documents across the table, "Rebecca Wilson is the majority shareholder and has been since Evergreen's founding. These ownership certificates confirm her 67% stake in the company through various investment vehicles." Terry Kaufman, the marketing director, frowned as she examined the papers. "This doesn't make sense. Mark always said he built this company from nothing, with just a small business loan and his contracting experience." "Mark believed what he needed to believe," I replied evenly. "The initial capital came from my personal investment fund, structured through Wilson Financial Holdings. Subsequent rounds of growth were similarly financed, though I remained a silent partner at Mark's insistence." "Why?" asked Michael Okonkwo, the chief financial officer, his expression more curious than hostile. "Why stay silent all these years? It was a fair question, perhaps the most important one. I considered my answer carefully. When Mark and I met, he had talent, vision, and drive, but struggled to secure funding for his first major project. I believed in his abilities, but knew from experience that men in construction and development often resist female involvement, particularly in leadership. I suggested a structure that would provide the capital he needed while allowing him to be the public face of Evergreen. I paused, aware of the skeptical glances being exchanged around the table. It was a compromise that seemed sensible at the time, and one that worked well for many years. Mark built an impressive operation with talented people. All of you are evidence of that. The arrangement might have continued indefinitely if not for recent discoveries of financial impropriety and misuse of company resources. This caught their attention. Michael sat up straighter, his CFO instincts clearly triggered. "What kind of impropriety?" he asked. Daniel distributed another set of documents. These outline the creation of A&M Ventures, an LLC established by Mark Wilson and Amber Collins 18 months ago. This entity has been used to purchase properties adjacent to planned Evergreen developments, using non-public information to secure investments that increased in value once Evergreen's projects were announced. There were murmurs of surprise and concern around the table. Property speculation using insider information was not just unethical, but potentially illegal, a fact that wouldn't be lost on anyone in the real estate development business. "There's more," Daniel continued. "These expense reports detail personal costs charged to Evergreen for activities unrelated to legitimate business operations." As the leadership team reviewed the evidence, I could see the shift happening in real time, skepticism giving way to concern, hostility transforming into uncertainty. Even Jackson and Terry, Mark's staunchest defenders, looked troubled by what they were seeing. "What happens now?" asked Lisa Torres, the head of sustainable design, voicing the question that was clearly on everyone's mind. "Evergreen continues," I said firmly. "The company's fundamentals are strong, our projects are sound, and our reputation in the industry remains excellent, for now. Our priority is to contain any potential damage from Mark's actions and ensure continuity for our clients, partners, and employees." I outlined the immediate steps: a full financial audit, suspension of any transactions involving A&M Ventures, transparent communication with key stakeholders, and temporary leadership restructuring while we assessed longer-term needs. "I'll be stepping in as interim CEO," I informed them. "My background is in finance and strategic investment, but I've been closely monitoring Evergreen's operations from the beginning, even if most of you weren't aware of it. Eleanor Walsh," I gestured to where Eleanor sat quietly observing the proceedings, "will serve as special advisor during this transition." Recognition flickered across several faces at the mention of Eleanor's name. Her reputation in Portland's business community was legendary, and her involvement lent immediate credibility to my leadership. "I understand this is a lot to process," I acknowledged. "You came to work for Mark Wilson's Evergreen, and now you're being told the company has always had a different ownership structure than you believed. Some of you may choose to leave, and I would understand that decision. For those who stay, I promise transparency, ethical leadership, and a renewed commitment to the innovative, community-focused development that made Evergreen successful in the first place." For a moment, no one spoke, the room heavy with the weight of revelation and recalibration. Then Michael Okonkwo, the CFO, closed the folder of documents and looked directly at me. "I worked closely with Mark for 6 years," he said slowly. "There were always financial details he kept closely guarded, decisions that didn't quite add up from a business perspective. Finding out there was another layer of ownership actually explains a lot." He nodded, seeming to come to a decision. "I'm in, Mrs. Wilson. Whatever you need to stabilize the company." Lisa Torres was next. "Evergreen's commitment to sustainable development is what brought me here 3 years ago. If that mission continues, I'm committed to seeing it through." One by one, most of the leadership team expressed similar sentiments: cautious support, a willingness to see where this new chapter might lead. Only Jackson and Terry remained, visibly resistant, exchanging glances that suggested they were already planning their exits. "Thank you for your candor and your tentative trust," I said when everyone had spoken. "I don't expect loyalty to develop overnight, but I do ask for your professionalism during this transition. I'll be meeting with each of you individually over the coming days to better understand your roles, concerns, and ideas for Evergreen's future." As the meeting concluded and the leadership team filed out, I remained seated, reviewing the notes I'd taken during our discussion. The initial hurdle had been cleared, not with unanimous support, but with enough buy-in to move forward. Now came the hard work of rebuilding a company culture based on transparency rather than carefully maintained fiction. Eleanor stayed behind after the others had left, settling into the chair beside me with an appraising look. "That went better than expected," she observed. "Most leadership transitions involving scandal don't achieve even that level of cautious acceptance on day one." I released a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. "It's just the beginning. Earning their genuine trust will take time and consistent action." "True," Eleanor agreed. "But you've laid a solid foundation. By addressing the issues head-on and presenting a clear path forward, you've given them something to rally around: stability, in the midst of chaos." She tapped her fingers thoughtfully on the polished conference table. "What's your plan for Mark? He won't stay silent for long." "Daniel is meeting with his attorney this afternoon. We're offering a settlement, a clean break with a reasonable financial package in exchange for his resignation and a non-disclosure agreement." "And if he refuses?" I met her gaze steadily. "Then we proceed with legal action regarding the funds diverted to A&M Ventures and his misuse of company resources. Our case is strong, as you know." Eleanor nodded, satisfaction evident in her expression. "He'll take the settlement. Men like Mark care more about their reputation than their principles. The possibility of a public legal battle that exposes his affair and financial misconduct will be incentive enough." As if summoned by our discussion, Daniel appeared in the doorway, tablet in hand. "Sorry to interrupt, but I've just received a message from Gerald Foster. He's representing Mark. They want to meet this afternoon." "Already?" I raised an eyebrow. "That was faster than expected." Daniel's mouth quirked in a half-smile. "Apparently, Mark tried to access his Evergreen accounts this morning and found everything frozen, including his compensation package. Gerald says his client is eager to resolve matters expeditiously." "I bet he is," Eleanor murmured. I stood, smoothing the lines of my suit. "Set it up for 3 o'clock. I want you there, Daniel, and have the settlement paperwork ready." After Daniel left to arrange the meeting, I turned to Eleanor. "Will you join me for a quick tour of the office? I've provided financial oversight for 15 years, but I've never really understood the day-to-day operations the way I should." For the next 2 hours, we moved through Evergreen's headquarters, observing workflow, speaking briefly with employees, and noting the company culture that Mark had built. Despite my issues with him personally, I had to acknowledge that in many ways he'd created something impressive, an innovative firm with clear processes and generally engaged staff. In the open plan design studio, architects and designers collaborated on sustainable building concepts. The project management team occupied a sunlit corner space filled with detailed models of current developments. The financial department, where Michael had welcomed us warmly, operated with efficiency and precision that suggested his leadership was both competent and respected. "He did some things right," I admitted to Eleanor as we rode the elevator back to the executive floor. "Many narcissists do," she replied matter-of-factly. "They often excel at building systems that showcase their vision. Where they fail is in the human element, genuine empathy, ethical boundaries, sharing credit. Your challenge will be preserving what works while excising the toxicity Mark embedded in the culture." The elevator doors opened, revealing Amber Collins standing in the reception area, arguing with security. She wore the same blue dress from yesterday's aborted vow renewal, though it looked considerably less fresh after what had clearly been a difficult night. "Ma'am, as I've explained, your access has been revoked," the security officer was saying firmly. "This is ridiculous," Amber insisted, her voice carrying across the space. "I'm the executive assistant to the CEO. I have personal items at my desk that I need to collect." I approached them, maintaining a calm exterior despite my surprise at her boldness. "Ms. Collins, I didn't expect to see you here today." She turned, her expression shifting from annoyance to a forced pleasantness that didn't reach her eyes. "Rebecca, I was just explaining to this gentleman that I need to collect my things." "Of course," I said reasonably. "We can arrange for your personal items to be packed and delivered to you. As for company property, phone, laptop, access cards, those should have remained on site when your access was terminated." "I have the right to collect my own belongings," she insisted, a hint of desperation creeping into her voice. I studied her more carefully, noting the slight tremor in her hands, the faint smudges of yesterday's makeup still visible beneath her eyes. Something wasn't right. "Officer," I addressed the security guard, "please escort Ms. Collins to her desk area. She may collect personal items only, under direct supervision, and her actions should be recorded on the security camera." The officer nodded, professional but firm. "This way, ma'am." As they walked toward Mark's executive area where Amber's desk was located, Eleanor leaned close to me. "That was interesting timing. Think Mark sent her to retrieve something incriminating?" "Almost certainly," I murmured. "Have it check the surveillance feeds from her desk area for the past few weeks. I want to know what she might be looking for." 30 minutes later, Amber left the building with a small box of personal effects, her expression tightly controlled, but unable to hide her frustration. The security officer reported that she had seemed particularly interested in accessing her computer, which had of course been locked, and had spent several minutes searching through a specific filing cabinet without success. "Intriguing," Daniel commented when I shared this information during our pre-meeting briefing. "I'll have our forensic team prioritize her work computer and email accounts." At precisely 3 o'clock, the receptionist announced the arrival of Mark and his attorney, Gerald Foster, a silver-haired partner at one of Portland's most prestigious law firms. I had met him at various charity functions over the years, but never in a professional capacity. His reputation was formidable, ruthlessly effective but not unethical, representing the city's elite in matters requiring discretion and expertise. We received them in the same conference room where I had met with the leadership team that morning, a deliberate choice meant to reinforce my position. Daniel sat beside me, Eleanor just beyond him, presenting a united front of legal and business authority. Mark entered first, looking considerably less polished than usual. His customary confident stride was absent, replaced by a tense, guarded posture. He had changed from yesterday's outfit into a dark suit that seemed to hang oddly on his frame, as though he had somehow diminished physically overnight. He avoided meeting my gaze directly, focusing instead on Daniel. Gerald Foster followed, impeccably dressed and carrying an expensive leather portfolio. His expression revealed nothing about his thoughts on representing a client in such a complicated situation. "Thank you for agreeing to meet so promptly," Gerald began after introductions were complete. "My client is interested in resolving this unfortunate situation with minimal disruption to all parties." "We share that goal," Daniel replied smoothly, sliding copies of our proposed settlement across the table. "We've prepared what we believe is a fair and reasonable resolution." Mark stared at the document without touching it, while Gerald reviewed the terms with practiced efficiency. The proposal was straightforward. Mark would immediately resign all positions at Evergreen and relinquish any claim to ownership or compensation beyond what was explicitly outlined in the settlement. In exchange, he would receive a one-time payment, of $5 million, substantially less than the value of the company he had believed was his, but far more generous than he deserved given the circumstances. The agreement also required him to dissolve A&M Ventures and surrender any properties acquired through it to Evergreen at cost. Finally, it included a non-disclosure clause preventing him from discussing the circumstances of his departure or making disparaging statements about Evergreen or its leadership. "This is robbery," Mark spoke for the first time, his voice tight with controlled anger. "You're trying to erase my 15 years of building this company from nothing." I met his gaze directly. "You didn't build it from nothing, Mark. You built it with my money, my connections, and my strategic guidance you often didn't even realize you were receiving." His jaw tightened. "I made Evergreen what it is. The vision, the execution, the reputation in the industry, that was all me." "Your contributions were significant," I acknowledged, keeping my tone neutral. "That's why we're offering $2.5 million rather than pursuing criminal charges for your misappropriation of company funds and resources." Gerald placed a restraining hand on Mark's arm as he opened his mouth to protest further. "Perhaps we could have a moment to discuss the terms privately?" I nodded, and we left them in the conference room, retreating to what had been Mark's office, now temporarily mine. Through the glass walls, we could see Gerald speaking intently to Mark, whose resistance appeared to be crumbling as his attorney laid out what must have been the stark reality of his situation. "He'll sign," Daniel predicted, watching the interaction. "Foster isn't one to sugarcoat things for clients who need to hear the truth." Sure enough, 15 minutes later, Gerald requested we rejoin them. Mark sat slumped in his chair, defeat evident in every line of his body. "My client is prepared to accept the terms with 2 modifications," Gerald stated professionally. "First, he requests that the settlement payment be increased to $3 million to reflect his years of service to the company." Daniel looked to me questioningly. I gave a slight nod. The additional $500,000 was insignificant compared to Evergreen's overall value and worth the expedited resolution. "And the second modification?" I asked. "The non-disclosure agreement should be mutual. While Mr. Wilson agrees not to discuss the circumstances of his departure, he requests the same commitment from Evergreen. No public statements about his personal conduct or the specific reasons for the separation." I considered this carefully. Part of me wanted the world to know exactly what Mark had done, the betrayal he had orchestrated while building his success on my investment. But a public scandal would damage Evergreen's reputation as well, potentially affecting innocent employees and ongoing projects. "We can agree to a mutual non-disclosure with one caveat," I replied after a moment. "We reserve the right to disclose relevant information to law enforcement or regulatory agencies if required by law, and to communicate necessary details to key stakeholders such as major clients and financial partners." Gerald conferred briefly with Mark, who nodded reluctantly. "Those terms are acceptable." Daniel made the necessary amendments to the agreement, and within 30 minutes it was signed by all parties. Mark's signature was barely legible, his hand trembling slightly as he completed the document that formalized the end of his career at Evergreen and, by extension, our marriage. As Gerald gathered the papers, Mark looked up at me, really seeing me for perhaps the first time since our confrontation began. "Was any of it real?" he asked quietly. "Us, I mean." The question caught me off guard with its nakedness, its vulnerability. Despite everything, despite the anger and betrayal, I found I couldn't respond with cruelty. "Yes," I said simply. "For many years, it was very real for me. I loved you, and I believed in what we were building together, both personally and professionally." He nodded slowly, absorbing this. "When did it change?" "You changed it," I replied, my voice steady but not unkind. "When you began seeing me as an accessory rather than a partner. When you started lying about working late while meeting Amber. When you decided that what we'd built wasn't enough and you needed to take More at my expense. Mark flinched at the directness of my answer but didn't deny it. Gerald, sensing the conversation had moved beyond legal matters into personal territory, tactfully suggested it was time to leave. As they prepared to go, I had one final question. The vow renewal. Why did you plan it when you were already involved with Amber? Was it just a cover? A flicker of something, shame perhaps, crossed Mark's face. It was her idea. She thought it would. He trailed off, apparently realizing how damning the full explanation would be. Throw me off the scent? I supplied. Create a public recommitment that would make your eventual departure seem more shocking and unexpected? His silence was confirmation enough. Goodbye, Mark, I said, standing to signal the end of our meeting and, effectively, our relationship. Daniel will be in touch regarding divorce proceedings. I suggest you use the same level of cooperation you've shown today. After they left, I remained in the conference room, staring out at the Portland skyline through the floor-to-ceiling windows. The familiar landscape of bridges, rivers, and urban architecture seemed somehow different, as though my changed perspective had altered the very city itself. Eleanor joined me, her presence comforting in its steadiness. One chapter closed, she observed. How are you feeling? I considered the question seriously. Lighter, I said finally, as though I've set down a heavy burden I didn't fully realize I was carrying. I turned to face her, but also aware that the hardest work is just beginning. Rebuilding Evergreen, redefining its future, establishing my own leadership. None of that will be easy. She smiled, the expression softening her normally formidable features. Easy is overrated. Meaningful is what matters. The remainder of the day passed in a blur of meetings, introductions, and immersion in the operational details of Evergreen. I spoke individually with several key project managers, reassuring them about the continuity of their developments despite the leadership change. Michael Okonkwo, the CFO, provided a detailed financial overview that confirmed my suspicion. Beyond Mark's specific improprieties with A&M Ventures, the company's fundamental position was strong. By 7 that evening, the offices had emptied, except for a skeleton crew of security personnel and a few dedicated employees finishing urgent tasks. I sat at what had been Mark's desk, now stripped of his personal items and family photos, reviewing project proposals and financial projections with a new sense of ownership and purpose. A soft knock at the door interrupted my concentration. Olivia stood there, 2 takeout bags from our favorite Thai restaurant in hand. I figured you might forget to eat, she said, entering and placing the food on the desk. Typical Becca move when you're deep in problem-solving mode. I smiled gratefully, suddenly aware of how hungry I was. You're a lifesaver. It's been. I searched for an adequate description of the day's intensity. Completely insane? Olivia supplied, unpacking containers of pad thai and green curry. I can only imagine. The whole thing is still blowing my mind, and I've known about your secret financial empire for years. As we ate, I filled her in on the day's events, the leadership team meeting, Amber's unexpected appearance, the settlement with Mark. Olivia listened attentively, asking occasional questions but mostly allowing me to process aloud the whirlwind transition I was navigating. So what happens next? She asked as we finished our meal. With the company, I mean. Do you stay on as CEO permanently? I leaned back in the ergonomic chair that had been adjusted to Mark's proportions, making a mental note to replace it with one that fit me properly. I'm not sure yet. I definitely want to guide Evergreen through this transition period, establish a new direction that builds on its strengths while correcting its weaknesses. Beyond that, I shrugged. I've never aspired to be a day-to-day CEO. My skills are more in strategy and investment than operational leadership. But you could be, Olivia pointed out. You've been quietly guiding Evergreen's biggest decisions for years. The only difference now is doing it openly." Her observation gave me pause. Perhaps she was right. Perhaps the only real difference was shedding the artificial constraints I'd placed on myself for so long. The thought was both daunting and exhilarating. "One day at a time," I said finally. "For now, I need to focus on stabilizing Evergreen and managing the transition. The long-term leadership structure can evolve once we're on solid footing." Olivia studied me with the insight that comes from decades of friendship. "You know what I'm finding remarkable about all this? You seem more at peace now, in the middle of corporate and marital meltdown, than you have in years." I considered this, searching for the right words to explain the strange sense of liberation I felt, despite the chaos. For 15 years, I've been living a divided life. Financial strategist by training, silent investor by choice, supportive wife by compromise. Every day required careful calculations about what I could say, how much I could reveal, which parts of myself needed to remain hidden to maintain the fiction that Mark's success was entirely his own. I gestured around the office, taking in the awards on the wall, many for projects I had quietly shepherded through financial hurdles, the architectural models of buildings I had helped make possible. Now everything is aligned. My knowledge, my capabilities, my position, my voice. All consistent, all authentic. Even in the midst of crisis, that alignment feels like freedom. Olivia nodded, understanding in her eyes. The truth is always less exhausting than fiction, even when it's complicated. As we cleaned up our impromptu dinner, I found myself thinking about tomorrow, the meetings I needed to schedule, the client relationships that required immediate attention, the staff whose confidence I needed to earn. The path ahead was challenging, but for the first time in years, I was walking it fully as myself, not as Mark's wife, not as a silent partner, but as Rebecca Wilson, exactly as I was meant to be. Later that night, as I finally returned to the home Mark and I had shared, I was struck by how different it felt. No longer a space defined by compromise and careful self-editing, but simply a house waiting to be reimagined according to my own vision. I moved through the rooms, seeing them with new eyes. The living room with its leather furniture that Mark had insisted upon, despite my preference for something warmer and more inviting. The kitchen where I had prepared countless meals while listening to him recount business victories that were, in many ways, as much mine as his. The home office where I had quietly managed my investments while he believed I was merely handling household accounts. Every space held memories of the careful dance I had performed for years, making myself smaller to protect his pride. Now those rooms felt both foreign and full of possibility, blank canvases awaiting a vision that was authentically mine. In my bedroom, I methodically removed Mark's remaining belongings from the closet, packing them into boxes for him to collect. His clothes, his watches, the golf trophies he displayed with such pride, all physical reminders of the life we had constructed together, a life built on a foundation that was partly genuine and partly illusory. As I worked, I found myself not so much grieving the end of our marriage as mourning the years I had spent diminishing myself. How many opportunities had I missed to fully engage with my capabilities? How many ideas had I stifled because they might have challenged Mark's perception of his own success? How many parts of myself had I hidden away, hoping that someday he would be secure enough to see me fully without feeling threatened? These questions had no simple answers, but they pointed toward a truth I was only now beginning to fully embrace. The compromises we make for love are only worthwhile when they lead to mutual growth, not persistent diminishment. I finished packing his things just after midnight, settling the final box beside the others in the guest room that had become a temporary storage space. Tomorrow, I would contact Mark's attorney to arrange for their removal. Another step in the systematic dismantling of our shared life. Yet as I prepared for bed, I felt not despair, but a curious sense of anticipation, as though I stood on the threshold of a new chapter whose pages were yet to be written. The path ahead held challenges, certainly, but also possibilities that had been unavailable to me while living within the constraints of Mark's expectations and my own self-imposed limitations. For the first time in 15 years, I would wake tomorrow as simply myself, Rebecca Wilson, neither diminished nor defined by relationship to others. And in that thought, despite everything, I found a measure of peace. The next morning arrived, with a clarity of purpose I hadn't experienced in years. I woke before my alarm, the early Portland sunlight filtering through the curtains I had always preferred open, while Mark insisted on closing against the morning brightness. Such a small thing, but it felt symbolic as I moved through my morning routine without adjusting my preferences to accommodate his. My phone buzzed with a text from Eleanor. Media inquiry from Portland Business Journal. They've heard rumors about changes in leadership at Evergreen. How do you want to handle? This was expected, in a business community as interconnected. As Portland's, news of Mark's sudden departure was bound to surface quickly. I replied as I dressed for the day. Prepare statement confirming leadership transition. Emphasize continuity of operations and projects. Minimal details. Reference mutual agreement to part ways. I chose my outfit with deliberate care, a deep blue suit that projected authority without pretension, accessorized with my mother's pearl necklace, a piece I rarely wore because Mark had once commented it looked old-fashioned. Today it felt right, a connection to my own history and the legacy that had made my current position possible. The drive to Evergreen's headquarters gave me time to mentally prepare for what promised to be another challenging day. The initial shock of the transition was giving way to practical questions. Who would lead which initiatives? How client relationships would be managed? What direction the company would take under new leadership? Addressing these concerns would require both clarity of vision and sensitivity to the uncertainty employees were feeling. The office was already buzzing with activity when I arrived at 7:30 a.m. The front desk staff greeted me with cautious respect. "Good morning, Mrs. Wilson," their tone suggesting they were still adjusting to my new role. In the elevator, two project managers fell silent when I joined them, exchanging awkward glances before mumbling good mornings. These small interactions highlighted the delicate nature of the transition. For years, these people had known me only as Mark's wife, an occasional visitor to the office, pleasant but peripheral. Now I was suddenly their boss, the owner of the company they had dedicated their careers to. The cognitive dissonance was understandable. Daniel was waiting in my office, his expression suggesting news that couldn't wait. IT completed their initial review of Amber's computer and email last night, he informed me without preamble. "You're going to want to see this." He handed me a tablet displaying a series of emails between Amber and Victor Lansing, CEO of Westridge Properties, one of Evergreen's main competitors. The messages, dating back nearly 8 months, revealed a calculated strategy that went far beyond a simple affair. Amber had been systematically gathering information about Evergreen's projects, client relationships, and internal operations, passing selected details to Lansing in exchange for promises of the executive position at Westridge. She was corporate. "Spying for a competitor," I said, the pieces falling into place. "And Mark?" Daniel swiped to reveal another thread of emails, these between Amber and Mark. He appears to have been initially unaware, then gradually drawn in. About 4 months ago, he discovered her communication with Lansing and confronted her. Instead of ending their relationship or reporting the corporate espionage, he negotiated himself into the arrangement. I felt a sick twist in my stomach as I read Mark's messages. Rather than being outraged by Amber's betrayal of Evergreen, he had seen it as an opportunity, leveraging her connection to Westridge to orchestrate a planned departure where he would bring key clients and staff with him, essentially gutting Evergreen from within before establishing a new firm with Westridge's backing. The A&M Ventures property acquisitions were just the beginning, Daniel explained. They were positioning themselves to poach Evergreen's best talent and clients during the upcoming River District project launch. The timing of your discovery couldn't have been better. Another month and they might have done significant damage. I set down the tablet, processing this expanded betrayal. It was one thing to discover your husband was having an affair, painful but sadly common. It was another to learn he had been actively conspiring to undermine the company I had quietly built and protected for 15 years. "Is this actionable legally?" I asked, my voice steady despite the turmoil of emotions beneath the surface. "Absolutely," Daniel confirmed. "Corporate espionage, breach of contract, breach of fiduciary duty, the settlement agreement you signed. With Mark yesterday doesn't shield him from these issues since they weren't fully known at the time. And it certainly doesn't protect Amber or Westridge. I considered our options, weighing the personal satisfaction of pursuing legal action against the potential impact on Evergreen. A public legal battle would attract exactly the kind of attention we were trying to avoid during this transition period. Contact Gerald Foster, I decided. Inform him of what we've discovered, and make it clear that while we prefer not to escalate this publicly, we will pursue all legal remedies if Mark doesn't immediately sever all ties with Westridge and provide full disclosure of any information that was shared. Daniel nodded. And Amber? She has no settlement protection at all. Prepare whatever legal actions you deem appropriate. If she wants to avoid civil and potentially criminal charges, she'll need to cooperate fully in documenting the extent of the corporate espionage. What about Westridge and Lansing? Daniel asked, making notes on his phone. I stared out the window at the Portland skyline, considering the competitive landscape of the development industry in the Pacific Northwest. Victor Lansing had a reputation for aggressive business tactics, but this crossed a line into potentially illegal territory. Let's gather more evidence before deciding how to approach Westridge, I said finally. If Lansing was aware he was receiving confidential information obtained through corporate espionage, that's a serious matter for his board of directors. But I want concrete proof before making any moves in that direction. As Daniel left to set these actions in motion, I turned my attention to the day's primary challenge, a company-wide staff meeting scheduled for 10 a.m. Nearly 150 employees would be gathered in the main conference center, all wondering about the sudden leadership change and what it meant for their jobs, projects, and future at Evergreen. Eleanor joined me to review the presentation we had prepared, offering suggestions to address the most likely concerns. Be honest but measured, she advised. They don't need all the sordid details, but they deserve the respect of a straightforward explanation about the ownership structure and your qualifications to lead. And when they ask why I hid my role for 15 years, I queried, anticipating one of the most difficult questions. Eleanor considered this. The truth, presented in its best light. You and Mark established a structure that allowed him to be the public face while you provided financial backing and strategic guidance. It's not uncommon in family businesses to have different roles based on individual strengths. At precisely 10 a.m., I entered the conference center where the entire Evergreen staff had assembled. The room fell silent as I made my way to the front, accompanied by Eleanor and Michael Okonkwo, the CFO who had emerged as one of my strongest allies during the transition. Good morning, I began, surveying the sea of faces, some curious, some concerned, some openly skeptical. Thank you all for being here. I recognize that the past 48 hours have brought unexpected changes to Evergreen, and you deserve clarity about what's happening and what it means for you and the company. I proceeded to outline the basic facts, that I was the majority, owner of Evergreen and had been since its founding, that Mark had stepped down from his role as CEO, and that I would be assuming leadership during this transition period. I emphasized the company's strong financial position, the continuity of all current projects, and our commitment to the innovative, sustainable development that had become Evergreen's trademark in the Portland market. Many of you are wondering why this is happening now and why my ownership role wasn't public knowledge before. I acknowledged, addressing the elephant in the room. When Evergreen was founded, Mark and I made a decision about how to structure our professional partnership. His strengths were in operations, client relationships, and the technical aspects of development. Mine were in finance, strategic planning, and investment. We created a structure that we believed played to our respective strengths. I paused, choosing my next words carefully. That structure served the company well for many years, allowing Evergreen to grow into the respected firm it is today. Recent events made it necessary to clarify the ownership and implement new leadership. Out of respect for all parties involved, I won't be sharing personal details, but I want to assure you that this transition is being managed with the best interests of Evergreen, its employees, and its clients as the top priority. After completing my prepared remarks, I opened the floor for questions. They came rapidly, covering everything from job security to project timelines to potential changes in company direction. I answered each one directly, acknowledging when I didn't yet have all the answers, but emphasizing my commitment to transparent communication as the transition unfolded. Lisa Torres, the head of sustainable design, raised her hand. Will you be continuing Evergreen's focus on environmentally responsible development? That vision has been central to our work, and many of us joined specifically because of it. Absolutely, I confirmed. In fact, I was often the driving force behind our most innovative sustainability initiatives, though that wasn't visible externally. My commitment to responsible development is unwavering, and I see opportunities to strengthen those efforts going forward. Jackson Chen, still clearly loyal to Mark despite the evidence of misconduct, posed a more challenging question. With all due respect, Mrs. Wilson, running a development company requires specific industry knowledge and relationships. What qualifies you to lead Evergreen beyond simply owning shares? The question was deliberately provocative, designed to undermine my credibility in front of the staff. Before I could respond, Michael stepped forward. "I'd like to address that," he said, his deep voice carrying authority. "For the past 6 years, I've managed Evergreen's finances. During that time, I received regular guidance and direction from Rebecca through what I believed were investment advisors representing our financial backers. The strategic decisions that shaped our growth and success, which projects to pursue, which markets to enter, how to structure our capital, came largely from those advisors who I now know were Rebecca working through her investment vehicles." He turned to address the room directly. "Her financial and strategic acumen is the foundation Evergreen was built on. Mark was the public face, but Rebecca was the architect of our financial success." His unexpected defense shifted the energy in the room. Several employees who had been visibly skeptical now looked thoughtful, reassessing their assumptions about my role and capabilities. I thanked Michael and addressed Jackson directly. "I understand your concern. Industry relationships are certainly important, and I'll be the first to acknowledge that Mark excelled in that area. I'll be working closely with our project directors and client relations team to ensure those relationships remain strong during this transition." As the meeting concluded, I invited employees to reach out with additional questions or concerns as they arose, emphasizing my open-door policy and commitment to clear communication. The initial tension had noticeably decreased, though it was clear that winning the full confidence of the staff would be a gradual process requiring consistent leadership over time. Eleanor lingered as the room emptied, employees returning to their departments with subdued conversations about what they had heard. "That went well," she observed. "Especially Michael's intervention. Having a respected insider validate your contributions made a significant difference." I nodded, grateful for his unexpected support. "We're not out of the woods yet, but it's a start." The remainder of the day passed in a blur of meetings, client calls to reassure key partners about the continuity of their projects, sessions with department heads to review ongoing initiatives, consultations with our public relations team about managing external communications regarding the leadership change. By late afternoon, Daniel returned with an update on the legal front. Gerald Foster requested a meeting tomorrow morning. From his tone, I'm guessing Mark is willing to cooperate rather than face additional legal exposure. And Amber? We've sent a formal cease and desist with notice of impending legal action. Her personal attorney reached out an hour ago, indicating she's open to discussion of terms. Translation: she's looking for immunity in exchange for information. I considered this, weighing our options. If her information helps establish the full extent of the corporate espionage and Westridge's involvement, it might be worth limited immunity. But I want full disclosure and a binding non-disparagement agreement at minimum. Daniel made a note. I'll set up the meeting through her attorney. What about Westridge? Our preliminary review suggests Lansing was fully aware he was receiving confidential information obtained inappropriately. This was the most complex aspect of the situation. Taking action against a major competitor required careful consideration of potential repercussions in the industry and business community. Let's complete our information gathering before deciding, I said after a moment. Once we have Mark's and Amber's statements, we'll have a clearer picture of Lansing's involvement and can determine the appropriate response. As the workday wound down, I found myself alone in the office that had been Mark's just days before. The space still felt foreign, arranged according to his preferences rather than mine. The massive desk positioned to maximize the impression of authority when clients entered. The awards and project photos selected to emphasize his role in Evergreen's success. The overall aesthetic, dark woods, leather, masculine tones, projecting an image of traditional corporate power. It would need to change, I decided. Not because it was Mark's, but because it didn't reflect my own leadership style or the company culture I hoped to foster moving forward. I made a note to speak with Lisa Torres about redesigning the executive spaces, something more collaborative, more open, embodying the innovative and sustainable values Evergreen championed in its development projects. My phone chimed with a message from Olivia. Dinner at my place tonight? You look like you could use a friend, a glass of wine, and some perspective that doesn't involve corporate espionage or broken vows. I smiled, grateful for her understanding of exactly what I needed. Yes, please. 7:30? Olivia's cozy purr. District Loft had been a sanctuary during difficult times throughout our friendship. Tonight was no exception. The warm lighting, comfortable furnishings, and aromas of her signature roasted vegetable pasta created an atmosphere of normalcy that had been notably absent from my life in recent days. You look better than I expected, she observed, pouring a generous glass of Oregon Pinot Noir as I settled onto her sofa. More focused than frazzled. There's something clarifying about crisis, I admitted, taking a grateful sip. When everything falls apart at once, you don't have the luxury of falling apart yourself. You just identify the next necessary action and take it. And how many necessary actions did you take today? She asked, returning to the kitchen to check on dinner. I recounted the day's events, the staff meeting, the discovery of the corporate espionage plot, the legal strategies taking shape. Olivia listened attentively as she finished preparing our meal, occasionally asking questions that helped me process the complexities I was navigating. It's extraordinary how quickly you've adapted, she remarked as we moved to her dining table. 3 days ago, you were Mark Wilson's wife with a secret financial empire. Now you're openly running a major development firm and handling corporate intrigue like a character in a business thriller. I laughed at her characterization, though it wasn't entirely inaccurate. I've always had the capabilities. I just kept them hidden to protect Mark's ego. The adaptation isn't to new skills, but to using them openly after years of operating in the shadows. We ate in comfortable silence for a few moments before Olivia posed the question I had been avoiding in my focus on immediate challenges. What do you want for yourself out of all this, Becca? Not for Evergreen, not for the employees or clients, but for you personally? I set down my fork, considering. Honestly, I'm not sure yet. For so long, my identity has been compartmentalized. Financial, strategist in private, supportive wife in public. Now that the walls between those parts of myself have come down, I'm still discovering what an integrated life looks like and what I truly want from it. Olivia nodded, understanding. That makes sense. You've been playing different roles for different audiences for years. Finding your authentic self after all that performance takes time. I do know I want to create something meaningful with Evergreen, I continued, the vision becoming clearer as I articulated it. Not just profitable buildings, but developments that genuinely improve communities and address real needs in Portland, affordable, housing integrated with market-rate units, sustainable designs that set new standards for the industry, projects that create beautiful, functional spaces for people across the economic spectrum. That sounds like the Becca I've always known, Olivia said with a smile. The one who sees money as a tool for creating positive change, not just accumulating wealth. As our conversation shifted to lighter topics, a mutual friend's recent art exhibition, Olivia's upcoming travel plans, I felt the tension of the past days begin to ease. Here, removed from the complexities of Evergreen's transition and my unraveling marriage, I could simply be myself without calculation or careful self-editing. Later, driving home through Portland's evening traffic, I reflected on Olivia's question about what I wanted for myself. Beyond the immediate goal of stabilizing Evergreen and addressing the corporate espionage threat, what future was I building? For 15 years, my life had been defined largely in relation to Mark, supporting his ambitions, protecting his ego, accommodating his preferences. Now, standing at this unexpected crossroads, I had the opportunity to reimagine my life according to my own vision, unconstrained by the compromises that had become second nature. The thought was both exhilarating and daunting. Freedom always came with the responsibility of choice, and choices revealed our true priorities and values. The decisions I made in the coming weeks and months would define not just Evergreen's future, but my own. As I pulled into the driveway of what had been our home and was now simply mine, I felt a sense of possibility that transcended the pain of betrayal and the complications of transition. Whatever challenges tomorrow brought, and there would certainly be many, I would face them as my complete self, no longer diminished by the need to make myself smaller for someone else's comfort. In that realization, despite everything, I found an unexpected gift, the liberation that comes from finally standing fully in your own truth. The meeting with Mark and his attorney began precisely at 9 a.m. the following morning in the neutral territory of Daniel's downtown law office rather than at Evergreen headquarters. I had chosen to arrive early, giving myself time to review the additional evidence of corporate espionage our IT team had uncovered overnight and to center myself before facing Mark again. Gerald Foster arrived first, impeccably dressed and carrying his signature leather portfolio. He greeted me with professional courtesy, but without the warmth he might have shown at the charity events where we had previously encountered one another. "Mrs. Wilson," he said, extending his hand, "I appreciate your willingness to meet again so soon. My client is eager to resolve these new concerns expeditiously." "I'm sure he is," I replied, my tone neutral but firm. "The evidence we've uncovered is quite concerning, Mr. Foster." Mark arrived 5 minutes later, looking considerably more composed than he had during our previous meeting. He had clearly made an effort with his appearance, freshly shaved, hair neatly styled, wearing one of his most expensive suits. The external polish couldn't quite mask the tension evident in his posture and the tightness around his eyes, but it suggested he had regained some measure of his customary self-assurance. "Rebecca," he acknowledged with a slight nod, taking the seat farthest from me at the conference table. Daniel entered last, bringing with him a folder containing printed copies of the most damning emails between Mark, Amber, and Victor Lansing of Westridge Properties. He distributed these methodically before taking his seat beside me. As I explained to Mr. Foster, Daniel began, his tone measured and professional, we have uncovered evidence of corporate espionage involving Evergreen, Ms. Collins, and Westridge Properties. The settlement agreement executed yesterday does not provide immunity for these activities, which appear to constitute both civil and potential criminal violations. Mark kept his expression carefully neutral as he reviewed the printed emails, but a muscle in his jaw twitched. A tell I recognized. From our years together, indicating he was more rattled than he wanted to appear, Gerald Foster spoke first. My client acknowledges communication with Westridge but characterizes these exchanges as preliminary discussions about potential collaboration, not corporate espionage. Collaboration, I repeated, unable to keep the edge from my voice. Is that what you call sharing proprietary information about Evergreen's River District strategy with a direct competitor? Or discussing which employees to target for recruitment once you established your new venture with Westridge's backing? Mark finally met my gaze directly. Business transitions happen all the time, Rebecca. Executives leave companies and take talent with them. It's not illegal to plan for the future. Planning for the future is one thing, Daniel interjected smoothly. Using confidential information obtained through your fiduciary position at Evergreen to benefit a competitor is quite another. And Ms. Collins's systematic gathering of internal data over an 8-month period goes well beyond normal business. Transitions. Gerald placed a restraining hand on Mark's arm as he opened his mouth to respond. Perhaps we could cut to the chase. What exactly are you seeking here? I sat back slightly, studying Mark's face. Despite his attempt at composure, I could see the calculation behind his eyes, assessing his exposure, weighing his options, looking for an escape route. It was an expression I'd seen countless times during our marriage when he found himself in difficult situations, though never with stakes this high. Full disclosure, I stated simply. We want to know exactly what information was shared with Westridge, which employees were approached about leaving Evergreen, and the complete details of the arrangement you and Amber negotiated with Victor Lansing. And in exchange? Gerald prompted. In exchange, Daniel replied, we would be willing to amend the existing settlement agreement rather than pursuing separate legal action regarding the corporate espionage. Mrs. Wilson's primary concern is protecting Evergreen's interests, not punitive measures against Mr. Wilson. This was true, though I admitted to myself that a part of me did want Mark to face consequences beyond the loss of his position and our marriage. The discovery of his planned corporate sabotage had cut even deeper than his affair, representing a betrayal not just of me personally, but of everything we had built together. Mark leaned forward, his business instincts visibly engaging. What kind of amendment are we talking about? Daniel outlined the proposed terms. Mark would provide sworn statements detailing all communications with Westridge, including specific information shared and employees approached. He would agree to expanded non-competition clauses preventing him from working with any Evergreen competitors for 3 years. The financial settlement would be reduced from $3 million to $1, $5 million to reflect the damage his actions could have caused, and he would provide testimony if needed in any legal proceedings against Amber Collins or Westridge Properties. As Daniel spoke, I watched the reality of his situation settle over Mark. The confident businessman I had married, the man who believed himself invincible in the corporate arena, was gradually being replaced by someone facing the genuine possibility of legal and professional ruin. This is extortion, he said finally, though his tone lacked conviction. You're threatening me with potential criminal charges to force a renegotiation of terms we already agreed upon. No, Mark, I corrected him quietly. We're offering you a path to resolve additional misconduct that wasn't disclosed when the original agreement was signed. You're free to reject these terms, in which case we'll proceed with separate legal action regarding the corporate espionage, including referral to the appropriate authorities for criminal investigation. Gerald requested a private conference with his client, and Daniel and I left them in the conference room to discuss their options. In the hallway outside, Daniel kept his voice low. "He'll take the deal," he predicted. "Foster knows the evidence is damning, and the potential consequences extend far beyond financial penalties. Mark's reputation in the industry would be destroyed by a public legal battle involving corporate espionage." I nodded, though I felt no satisfaction in this assessment. Despite everything, despite the betrayal and the calculated attempt to undermine Evergreen, I took no pleasure in Mark's downfall. What I felt instead was a profound sadness for what could have been. The partnership we might have had if ego and ambition hadn't corrupted his values and judgment. After 20 minutes, Gerald opened the door and invited us back into the conference room. Mark sat with his shoulders slumped, the facade of confidence now completely absent. "My client is prepared to accept your terms with one modification," Gerald stated. "He requests that the financial settlement be adjusted to $2 million rather than $15 million in recognition of his 15 years building Evergreen's client relationships and market position." Daniel looked to me questioningly. I considered briefly before nodding my assent. The additional $500,000 was insignificant compared to Evergreen's overall value, and worth the expedited resolution that would allow us to focus on stabilizing the company rather than protracted legal battles. "Agreed," Daniel confirmed. "We'll prepare the amended settlement for signature this afternoon. In the meantime, we'll need Mr. Wilson to begin providing details about his communications with Westridge." For the next 2 hours, Mark answered questions about his arrangement with Victor Lansing, detailing when the relationship had begun, what information had been shared, and which Evergreen employees had been approached about joining the planned new venture. His responses were reluctant at first, but as the session continued, he seemed almost relieved to unburden himself of the deception he had been maintaining. What emerged was a picture of opportunism, rather than a meticulously planned conspiracy. Amber had initiated contact with Lansing shortly after joining Evergreen, impressed by his reputation as an aggressive and ambitious developer willing to push boundaries. She had provided general information about Evergreen's operations initially, positioning herself as a potential future employee at Westridge. When Mark discovered their communication, instead of terminating Amber or reporting the corporate espionage, he saw an opportunity to leverage the situation for his own benefit. He had been growing restless at Evergreen, chafing at what he perceived as limitations on his vision and ambition. The reality, which he now reluctantly acknowledged, was that many of his more grandiose ideas had been quietly vetoed through the investment. Oversight, I had maintained. Decisions made to protect Evergreen's long-term stability rather than chase short-term prominence. "I felt constrained," he admitted during a particularly revealing moment. "Like I'd built something significant, but couldn't take it to the next level because invisible investors kept pulling back on my more ambitious plans." He glanced at me briefly. "I didn't know those invisible investors were you." In that moment, I saw with painful clarity the fundamental disconnect that had undermined our partnership. What I had viewed as prudent financial stewardship, he had experienced as frustrating limitation. What I had intended as collaborative guidance, he had perceived as mysterious obstruction. Perhaps if I had been honest from the beginning about my role, if I hadn't maintained the fiction that his success was entirely his own, we might have navigated these differences openly. Instead, my well-intentioned effort to protect his pride had created the very conditions that led to his resentment and eventual betrayal. By the time our meeting concluded, Mark had provided comprehensive information about his interactions with Westridge, including names of employees who had been approached, specific proprietary data that had been shared, and details of the arrangement that would have established a new development firm competing directly with Evergreen. As he prepared to leave, Mark paused, his expression suggesting he wanted to say something further. For a moment, I thought he might offer an apology or some acknowledgement of the pain his actions had caused. Instead, he simply asked, "What will you do about Westridge?" The question surprised me, though perhaps it shouldn't have. Even now, facing the consequences of his own misconduct, the businessman in him was calculating competitive advantage and industry positioning. "That's no longer your concern," I replied, not unkindly but with finality. "Your focus should be on moving forward within the parameters of our agreement." He nodded, accepting this boundary, and left with Gerald Foster. I remained seated at the conference table, feeling a curious mixture of closure and emptiness. Another chapter of the dismantling of our life together complete. Another piece of the man I thought I knew revealed as something different than I had believed. Daniel gathered his notes, his expression sympathetic. "You handled that with remarkable composure." Not everyone could face their spouse under these circumstances with such dignity. I appreciated his comment, but felt no particular pride in my self-control. It's not about dignity so much as necessity. Falling apart won't protect Evergreen or help me rebuild what Mark nearly destroyed. "Still," he persisted, "it's admirable. And for what it's worth, I think the company is incredibly fortunate to have you stepping in openly after all these years." Back at Evergreen's headquarters, I found Eleanor waiting in my office, reviewing the latest media coverage of the leadership transition. The Portland Business Journal had published an article that morning with the headline, "Evergreen Construction Reveals Surprise Ownership. Rebecca Wilson steps out of shadows and into CEO role." "It's actually quite balanced," Eleanor observed, showing me the piece. "They mention your background in financial strategy and investment, characterize the transition as unexpected but orderly, and quote several industry analysts predicting continued success under your leadership." I skimmed the article, relieved that the narrative remained focused on the business aspects of the transition rather than speculation about the personal circumstances that had precipitated it. Our careful messaging appeared to be working so far, though I harbored no illusions that the Portland business community's curiosity would be satisfied indefinitely with our sanitized version of events. "What's our next priority?" Eleanor asked, shifting from PR concerns to strategic planning. I considered the question, weighing the various challenges demanding attention. The meeting with Mark had resolved one significant threat, but multiple issues still required immediate focus. Reassuring key clients, stabilizing the internal team after the departure of both Mark and Amber, and determining how to address Westridge's role in the corporate espionage. "Let's start with Victor Lansing," I decided. "We need to neutralize the threat from Westridge before they attempt to poach our clients or employees." Eleanor nodded approvingly. "Direct approach or behind the scenes?" "Both," I replied, my strategy taking shape as I spoke. "I want to meet with Lansing personally, just the two of us, no attorneys. Meanwhile, I think it's time to activate some of my other investment connections." A slow smile spread across Eleanor's face as she grasped my intention. "Meridian Holdings?" I nodded. Meridian Holdings was one of my larger investment vehicles, a private equity firm that specialized in real estate ventures across the Pacific Northwest. Few people knew of my controlling interest in Meridian, which had deliberately maintained a low profile despite its significant portfolio. Meridian holds a 15% stake in Westridge's parent company, I confirmed. Not enough for control, but certainly enough to request a board meeting regarding potential corporate misconduct by the CEO. "Beautiful," Eleanor murmured. "Lansing won't even know what hit him." I made 2 calls, one to Victor Lansing's office requesting a private meeting the following morning, and another to James Harrington, the managing director of Meridian Holdings, who handled my interests in the firm. By the time I hung up from the second call, a board meeting of Westridge's parent company had been scheduled for the end of the week to discuss governance concerns related to potential misconduct by executive leadership. With those pieces in motion, I turned my attention to Evergreen's internal operations. Michael Okonkwo, the CFO who had emerged as a key ally, had prepared a detailed assessment of our current projects and financial position. His report confirmed what I already suspected. Beyond the specific areas where Mark had been planning his corporate sabotage, the company remained fundamentally sound. Our biggest vulnerability is the River District project, Michael explained as we reviewed the materials together. It's our most ambitious development to date, and Mark was personally handling several key client and municipal relationships. We need to establish new points of contact quickly to maintain momentum. I agreed, making notes about specific relationships that required immediate attention. What about staffing? Do we have a clear picture of which employees were approached about leaving for the new venture Mark was planning? Michael nodded, flipping to a separate section of his report. Based on what we've pieced together from email reviews and Mark's disclosure today, 7 people were directly approached. 3 project managers, 2 architects from the design team, our head of client relations, and Jackson Chen. I wasn't surprised to see Jackson's name on the list. His loyalty to Mark had been evident from the beginning of the transition, and his hostile questions during the staff meeting suggested he might have already been aligned with Mark's exit strategy. Where do they stand now? I asked. 5 have proactively reached out to express their commitment to Evergreen, including a couple who admitted they had preliminary conversations with Mark but decided against leaving. Jackson and Terry Kaufman remain question marks. They're doing their jobs but haven't engaged with the transition leadership. This aligned with my observations of their behavior over the past few days. Schedule one-on-one meetings with each of them for tomorrow, I requested. I want to address their concerns directly and determine whether they're committed to Evergreen's future. The remainder of the day passed in a blur of operational details, reviewing project timelines, addressing staffing adjustments necessitated by Amber's departure, and preparing for client meetings scheduled for the following day. By the time I left the office at 8 p.m., I felt both exhausted and oddly energized by the tangible progress we were making in stabilizing Evergreen amid the tumult of transition. As I drove home, I found myself thinking about the meeting scheduled with Victor Lansing the next morning. He had agreed surprisingly quickly to see me, perhaps curious about the leadership change at Evergreen, or believing he might gain some competitive advantage from the upheaval. Whatever his motivation, he was in for a significant surprise when he discovered the extent of my knowledge about his involvement in the corporate espionage. At home, I made a simple dinner and brought it to the sunroom at the back of the house, a space I had always loved but rarely used because Mark preferred eating at the formal dining table or in front of the television in his den. Sitting there, surrounded by plants and with a view of the garden I had painstakingly cultivated over the years, I felt a moment of genuine peace amid the chaos of recent days. The house itself was beginning to feel different, transformed from a space defined by compromise and careful navigation of Mark's preferences to one that reflected my own tastes and rhythms. I had already made small changes, rearranging furniture, displaying art I loved that Mark had relegated to storage, opening spaces that he had preferred to keep formal and separate. These physical alterations mirrored the internal shifts happening within me, a reclaiming of space, preferences, and identity that had been subordinated for too long. Even amid the pain of betrayal and the professional challenges I was navigating, I recognized this process of reclamation as healing, necessary, and surprisingly satisfying. My phone rang, interrupting these reflections. It was Olivia, checking in as she had each evening since the confrontation at the Vow Renewal. "How was the meeting with Mark?" she asked without preamble. I filled her in on the key details, the renegotiated settlement, his disclosure about Westridge, the planned approach to Victor Lansing. Olivia listened without interruption, though I could almost feel her processing the information and formulating questions. "It's strange," I admitted when I had finished recounting the day's events. "I'm angry about what he did, but I also feel oddly responsible in some way. If I had been honest from the beginning about my role at Evergreen, perhaps things would have unfolded differently. Or perhaps not, Olivia countered gently. Mark's choices were his own, Becca. Your desire to protect his ego didn't force him to have an affair or engage in corporate espionage. Those were active decisions he made, knowing they would hurt you and potentially damage Evergreen. Her perspective was logical, of course, but emotions rarely followed the clean lines of logic. I know that intellectually, I acknowledged. But I keep wondering if my deception, however well-intentioned, created the conditions that led to his. That's giving him too much credit and yourself too much blame, Olivia said firmly. You made a compromise in how you structured your business relationship, one that benefited him enormously, by the way. He made a choice to betray not just his wife, but his business partner and the company you built together. As always, Olivia's clarity helped me see the situation more objectively. While I could acknowledge that my approach to our business partnership had been imperfect, it didn't justify or explain away Mark's calculated betrayal. Accepting appropriate responsibility for my choices didn't require assuming blame for his. After we hung up, I moved to my home office, formerly our shared office, though Mark had used it infrequently, preferring to work from Evergreen's headquarters. I spent an hour preparing for my meeting with Victor Lansing, reviewing what we knew about his involvement in the corporate espionage and considering different approaches based on how he might respond. Lansing had a reputation as an aggressive businessman who pushed legal and ethical boundaries in pursuit of competitive advantage. His willingness to engage with Amber and Mark in sharing Evergreen's proprietary information aligned with this reputation, but it also exposed him to significant legal and professional risk I was prepared to leverage in protecting Evergreen's interests. As I compiled notes for our meeting, I found myself reflecting on how differently I might have approached this situation just a week earlier. Before discovering Mark's betrayal, I had operated within carefully constructed boundaries, always conscious of how my actions might affect his position or ego. Now, liberated from those constraints, I could engage directly with competitors, assert Evergreen's interests, and utilize the full extent of my business acumen and connections without self-imposed limitations. The realization was both empowering and sobering, a reminder of how much of myself I had suppressed for the sake of a partnership that had ultimately proved illusory. The woman preparing to face Victor Lansing tomorrow was not the carefully diminished version of Rebecca Wilson, who had stood in Mark's shadow for 15 years, but the full expression of my capabilities, experience, and determination. Victor Lansing had no idea what was coming his way. Neither, I realized with a small smile, did Portland's development community, which was about to discover exactly what happened when Rebecca Wilson finally stepped fully into her power. Victor Lansing's office occupied the top floor of one of Portland's newer glass towers, the kind of sleek, modern space designed to project success and confidence. As I was escorted through the reception area by his perfectly polished assistant, I noted the strategic placement of architectural models showcasing Westridge's most prominent developments, awards displayed in custom lighting, and a waiting area, arranged to make visitors feel simultaneously impressed and slightly intimidated. It was textbook power staging, and once I might have found it effective. Today, understanding the theatrical nature of such displays, I simply observed the details with professional curiosity. Victor rose from behind an enormous desk when I entered, extending his hand with a practiced smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. At 52, he maintained the fitness of someone decades younger, his tailored suit emphasizing broad shoulders and a trim waist. His salt and pepper hair was expertly styled in a way that suggested distinguished experience rather than age. "Rebecca Wilson," he greeted me, his voice carrying the slight rasp that came from years of expensive cigars. "A pleasure to finally meet you properly. I believe we've crossed paths at various industry functions over the years." "Always as Mark's wife," I acknowledged, accepting his handshake with a firm grip. "Never as Evergreen's majority owner. That's about to change." If my directness surprised him, he concealed it well. gesturing toward a seating area by the floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a panoramic view of the Willamette River. Indeed, your emergence as Evergreen's leader has been the talk of Portland's development community. Quite the revelation. I took a seat, noting how the guest chair was positioned slightly lower than his, another subtle power play. I imagine it wasn't a revelation to you, though, was it, Victor? Given your extensive communications with Amber Collins and Mark over the past 8 months. To his credit, Lansing's expression barely flickered, though I detected the slightest tensing of his shoulders. I'm not sure what you're implying. I've had occasional professional contact with Mark, as one would expect between colleagues in the same industry. Let's not waste time with denials, I suggested, opening the slim portfolio I had brought with me and removing a single sheet of paper containing dates, times, and brief descriptions of communications between him, Amber, and Mark. We have extensive documentation of information exchanged illegally between Amber Collins, Mark Wilson, and yourself. Information that unquestionably constitutes corporate espionage. I handed him the paper, watching as he scanned it with practiced nonchalance that couldn't quite mask his growing concern. The list was comprehensive enough to demonstrate the seriousness of our evidence without revealing everything we knew, a strategic decision Daniel and I had made during our preparation. These appeared to be routine business communications, Lansing said after a moment, setting the paper down with deliberate casualness. Nothing here suggests anything improper. That's just the summary page, Victor. The full documentation includes email content, text messages, and recorded conversations. Particularly interesting are the discussions about utilizing Evergreen's proprietary information regarding the River District project to secure adjacent properties through shell companies. Or perhaps you'd prefer to discuss the planned recruitment of key Evergreen staff for the new venture you were establishing with Mark. Lansing's facade of indifference cracked slightly. He leaned forward, recalibrating his approach. Business is business, Rebecca. Transitions happen, opportunities arise. Nothing illegal about exploring potential collaborations or hiring talented people. There is, however, something quite illegal about obtaining and utilizing confidential proprietary information through corporate espionage, I countered smoothly. As I believe the board of Westridge's parent company might agree when they meet later this week to discuss these very issues. This landed with visible impact. Lansing's eyes narrowed slightly, the calculation behind them accelerating. The board? And how exactly would Evergreen's concerns reach our board level? I smiled, feeling a quiet confidence that came from knowing I held cards he didn't even realize were in play. Meridian Holdings has requested the special board meeting. As a significant shareholder in your parent company, they have expressed governance concerns regarding potential misconduct by executive leadership. The mention of Meridian Holdings registered immediately. Lansing's expression shifted from calculated confidence to genuine alarm, if only momentarily. As a sophisticated businessman, he understood the implications. Meridian was known for its substantial portfolio and strategic influence in Pacific Northwest real estate. What he didn't know, what almost no one knew, was that I controlled Meridian through one of my investment vehicles. What exactly are you looking for here, Rebecca? He asked, his tone now considerably more serious. If this is some kind of negotiation, let's be direct about terms. I want 3 things, I replied without hesitation. First, immediate cessation of all efforts to utilize Evergreen's proprietary information or approach our staff. Second, dissolution of the planned venture you were developing with Mark and Amber. Third, a formal written acknowledgement that Westridge inappropriately obtained confidential information from Evergreen employees. Lansing's expression hardened. The third is a non-starter. I won't sign anything that could be construed as an admission of wrongdoing. Then we proceed with the board meeting and subsequent legal action, I said simply, gathering my portfolio as if preparing to leave. Meridian's representatives are quite persuasive, Victor, and they have the full documentation, not just this. Summary page. He raised a hand, signaling me to wait. Let's not be hasty. I'm sure we can find middle ground that protects everyone's interests. This isn't a negotiation where we meet in the middle, I clarified, keeping my voice level, but firm. These are the minimum terms required to prevent escalation to board level and potential legal proceedings. I'm offering a path for resolution that allows you to maintain your position and Westridge's market standing. That offer expires when I leave this office. The reality of his situation was visibly settling over Lansing. He had gambled on an unethical shortcut to competitive advantage and now found himself exposed to consequences he hadn't anticipated. The calculated risk he had taken in engaging with Amber and Mark now threatened not just a project or transaction, but his entire professional position. I need to consult with counsel before agreeing to anything in writing, he said finally. Understandable, I acknowledged. You have until 5 p.m. today. After that, Meridian proceeds with the board meeting as scheduled. As I stood to leave, Lansing remained seated, his expression suggesting he was already mapping potential escape routes and damage control strategies. You're not at all what I expected, Rebecca, he observed, something close to reluctant respect in his tone. I'm exactly who I've always been, Victor, I replied. The difference is that I'm no longer hiding it. The satisfaction I felt walking out of Lansing's office wasn't about winning a confrontation or exerting power. It was the quiet confidence that came from standing fully in my truth after years of carefully constructed diminishment. The Rebecca. Wilson, who had entered that office, was not Mark's supportive wife or a silent background figure, but a formidable businesswoman protecting what she had built. By 4:30 that afternoon, Lansing's attorneys had delivered signed documents meeting all our requirements. Westridge would cease all activities utilizing Evergreen's information. The planned venture with Mark and Amber was officially abandoned, and while they had carefully worded the acknowledgement to limit legal exposure, it provided sufficient admission of improper conduct to serve as protection against future incursions. Congratulations, Daniel said as we reviewed the final documents in my office. You've effectively neutralized 3 significant threats to Evergreen in less than a week. Mark, Amber, and now Westridge. I appreciated his praise but felt more thoughtful than triumphant. It's just the beginning of stabilizing the company. We still have client relationships to solidify, staff confidence to rebuild, and projects to keep on track. True, he acknowledged. But you've created the foundation for that work to proceed without the distractions of litigation or competitive sabotage. That's no small achievement. As we concluded our review, Michael appeared in the doorway, his expression suggesting news that couldn't wait. The City Planning Commission just approved our modified proposal for the River District project, he announced with barely contained excitement. We got everything we asked for, the density variance, the mixed-use zoning, even the height exception for the sustainable design elements. This was unexpected good fortune. The River District project represented Evergreen's most ambitious development to date, a 6-block area being transformed from outdated industrial space to a vibrant mixed-use district with affordable housing, market-rate apartments, office space, and retail. Mark had been personally handling the negotiations with city officials, and I had worried that his departure might delay or complicate the approval process. That's excellent news, I said, genuinely pleased. What pushed it through so smoothly? I was expecting at least some challenges given the leadership transition. Michael smiled, a hint of mischief in his expression. Apparently, your reputation preceded you. Commissioner Jenkins mentioned that her graduate school thesis on sustainable urban development had cited your early work with the Meridian Foundation. She seemed quite impressed that you were taking a more active role in Evergreen's projects. I had forgotten about that connection. Years ago, through one of my philanthropic initiatives, I had funded research on integrating affordable housing into high-end urban developments without sacrificing financial viability. That work had influenced several municipal approaches to development requirements, including some of Portland's policies. Sometimes our past efforts create unexpected allies, I observed. Let's make sure we deliver something worthy of the commissioner's confidence. As Michael left to share the good news with the project team, Daniel gathered his documents, pausing before departing. Rebecca, if I may say something a bit more personal? I nodded, curious about his hesitation. In 20 years of legal practice, I've guided many clients through difficult transitions, corporate restructuring, leadership changes, personal betrayals that affected business interests. What I'm witnessing with you is exceptional. You've faced multiple devastating revelations, both personal and professional, yet you're handling each challenge with remarkable clarity and purpose. His words touched me more deeply than I had expected. Thank you, Daniel. Some days it feels like I'm simply doing what's necessary to survive the moment. Perhaps, he acknowledged, but how we respond in crisis reveals our true character. Yours is impressive. After he left, I stood by the window of my office, looking out at the Portland skyline as afternoon light gilded the buildings with warm, golden tones. The city looked both familiar and somehow new from this vantage point, a fitting metaphor for my current perspective on a life and business I had been part of for 15 years, but was now seeing through entirely different eyes. A week had passed since I had discovered Mark's email about the Bora Bora reservation with Amber. A single week that had transformed nearly every aspect of my existence: my marriage, my professional identity, my daily routines, my understanding of my own capacity for resilience. The pain of betrayal remained, a dull ache beneath the surface of each day's activities. I suspected it would linger for some time, occasionally sharpening into moments of acute grief for what I had believed was real and had discovered was partly illusion. But alongside that, pain grew something unexpected, a sense of liberation, possibility, and authentic engagement with my own power that I had denied myself for too long. My phone signaled an incoming message from Olivia. Dinner tonight to celebrate the River District approval? I hear a certain planning commissioner is quite impressed with Evergreen's new leadership. News traveled fast in Portland's professional circles. I smiled and responded affirmatively, grateful for her consistent support through this tumultuous period. As I prepared to leave for the day, Lisa Torres, our head of sustainable design, appeared in my doorway with several rolled blueprints under her arm. "Do you have a few minutes?" she asked. "I've been thinking about how we might enhance the community spaces in the River District project now that we have the approvals." "Absolutely," I replied, genuinely interested. Lisa's innovative approach to creating functional, beautiful spaces that serve diverse community needs had been one of the reasons I had advocated for her promotion years ago. A recommendation I had made through the anonymous investor channels I had used to influence Evergreen's direction while remaining in the background. She spread the plans across the conference table in my office, explaining her vision for transforming what had originally been designated as standard green space into a more dynamic community resource with gardens, flexible gathering areas, and amenities designed to encourage interaction across socioeconomic lines. Mark always pushed back on these elements, she explained, a hint of residual frustration in her tone. He saw them as unnecessary costs that reduced profitability without adding marketable value. I studied the plans, appreciating both their aesthetic appeal and their functional purpose. He was wrong, I said simply. These spaces are precisely what will distinguish the River District from every other development in Portland. They're not extraneous costs. They're central to creating a genuinely sustainable community rather than just another collection of buildings. Lisa's expression brightened, her passion for the project visibly rekindled. That's exactly it. These aren't just decorative features. They're the connective tissue that will make the district function as a cohesive neighborhood rather than isolated blocks. For the next hour, we refined her concepts, discussing implementation strategies and potential modifications to the existing budget to accommodate the enhanced community elements without compromising the project's financial fundamentals. It was the kind of deeply engaged creative collaboration I had rarely experienced at Evergreen during Mark's leadership, where decisions were typically funneled through his perspective with limited opportunity for exploration of alternatives. As Lisa gathered her plans, clearly energized by our discussion, she paused at the door. "I just want to say, I've been at Evergreen for 5 years, and this is the most excited I've felt about our work in a long time. The way you engage with the vision behind the designs, not just the financial metrics, it makes a difference." Her words stayed with Auboy. Me as I drove to meet Olivia for dinner, underscoring a truth I was only beginning to fully appreciate. Leadership wasn't just about making decisions or holding authority. It was about creating environments where others could bring their best work forward, where innovation flourished because people felt both challenged and supported. For years, I had exercised influence at Evergreen indirectly, carefully filtering my ideas through channels that wouldn't threaten Mark's position or ego. Now, stepping fully into leadership, I could engage directly with talented people like Lisa, collaborating openly to create something better than either of us might have envisioned alone. Olivia was waiting at our favorite waterfront restaurant when I arrived, a bottle of champagne already chilling at the table. "To the River District approval," she toasted once our glasses were filled, and to Rebecca Wilson finally claiming her rightful place in Portland's business community. I smiled at her characteristic directness. "It's been quite a week." "Quite a transformation," she corrected. "I've watched you evolve from shell-shocked betrayed wife to formidable CEO in the space of days. It's both impressive and slightly terrifying." We laughed together, the moment of lightness welcome after days of intense challenges and difficult conversations. As our dinner progressed, I found myself speaking less about the practical aspects of Evergreen's transition, and more about the personal journey I was navigating, the simultaneous grief and liberation, the process of reclaiming spaces and decisions that had long been compromised. "I'm redecorating the house," I mentioned as we finished our main course. "Starting with the bedroom, then the living spaces. I've already donated most of Mark's remaining things to charity." Olivia nodded approvingly. "Physical spaces shape our mental states more than we realize. Changing your environment is a powerful way to reinforce your new reality." "It's not just about erasing him," I clarified, wanting to express the nuance of what I was feeling. "It's about creating spaces that reflect who I am now, without the constant calculation of another person's preferences and reactions." "That's the heart of it, isn't it?" Olivia observed. "Not just the betrayal itself, but the recognition of how much of yourself you had muted to accommodate him. The affair was a catalyst, but the real journey is reclaiming your full voice." Her insight crystallized something I had been feeling but hadn't fully articulated. The deepest injury wasn't Mark's relationship with Amber, or even his corporate scheming. It was the gradual diminishment of self I had accepted in service to a partnership that proved ultimately unequal and unsustainable. "Yes," I agreed softly. "And that's why, despite everything, I feel more alive now than I have in years. There's pain, certainly, but also a kind of awakening." As we parted after dinner, Olivia hugged me with unusual fierceness. "I'm so proud of you, Becca. Not just for handling this crisis with grace, but for embracing the opportunity within it. You're becoming more fully yourself, and it's beautiful to witness." Driving home through Portland's evening traffic, I reflected on her words and the journey of the past week. The path ahead still held countless challenges: rebuilding Evergreen's culture, finalizing my divorce from Mark, establishing my authentic leadership style, reimagining my personal life as a single woman after 15 years of marriage. Yet facing these challenges no longer felt daunting in the way it might have even days ago. Each step forward, whether confronting Victor Lansing, collaborating with Lisa on the River District vision, or simply choosing new paint colors for my bedroom, represented another moment of reclaiming my true voice and power. As I pulled into the driveway of what was now unquestionably my home, I noticed the garden I had planted years ago was in full bloom, vibrant colors catching the last light of evening. I had always loved gardening, finding peace in the process of nurturing growth and beauty, though Mark had often suggested hiring landscapers instead of wasting time on such activities. Looking at those flowers now, plants I had selected, positioned and tended myself, I saw them as silent witnesses to my journey. They had been there through years of compromise and careful self-editing, and now they remained, flourishing as I stepped fully into a new chapter defined not by what I had lost, but by what I was reclaiming. Tomorrow would bring new challenges at Evergreen, further steps in the divorce proceedings, and ongoing adjustments to my transformed reality. But tonight, in this moment of quiet reflection, I felt a profound gratitude for the unexpected gift hidden within betrayal. The opportunity to rediscover who Rebecca Wilson truly was when freed from the constraints of diminishment. The woman who would wake tomorrow and continue rebuilding both a company and a life was not Mark's wife or a silent partner or a carefully muted version of herself. She was simply, powerfully, authentically me, exactly as I was meant to be all along. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.